All right, we are going to go over lesson 4-2, which is called Representing Decimals Through Thousandths. So what I need you to do right now is make sure that you have your math journal nearby and your thousandths grid. So you should have a thousandths grid handout also, because we will be doing some guided practice through today's lesson. So, before we begin the lesson, let's do a little bit of mental math. Yesterday, we were writing decimal numbers. So what I would like you to do is, if you have that thousandths grid, go ahead and flip it over and get a pencil. And I would like you to write this decimal number, 3 1/10. 3 1/10. So you are not writing it in words. I would like you to write it in numerals, so in number form. So go ahead and write down 3 1/10. All right, now that you've done that, let's see, did you get it right? Check your work. 3 1/10. All right, the second number I would like you to write in number form is 27 8/10. 27 8/10. Go ahead and write that in numeral form. And let's see if you got it right. 27 8/10. Let's try 2 more. Practice from yesterday's lesson. All right, I would like you to write in number or numeral form 6 71/100. 6 71/100. All right, let's see if you got it right. How'd you do? All right, the last one we are going to do today is 73 65/100. 73 65/100. Okay, let's check. 73 65/100. So remember that decimal really is an and. Okay, as we go through today's lesson, I know it's a wee bit weird since, we're doing it, let's move this out of the way, on a video, but I am going to ask you to pause the video a few times so you can go ahead and work in your math journal or on your thousandths grid paper. So please make sure you're pausing your video so that way you're not watching the answer before you have the answer down on your paper. So the first time I'm going to ask you to pause your video is actually for the math message. So go ahead and put your thousandths grid off to the side. And I would like you to open to page 114. 114. Let's go ahead and write that up. This is page 114. And on that page, you will see that it says math message. You are just going to do the first 3 problems. So you are going to write in words, then you are going to fill it in a place value chart, and then I would like you to shade in. So this is where you are going to use your coloring supplies. Shade in the grid. We talked about yesterday how this whole flat represents 1. Each long represents 1/10, and each little square represents 100th. So you are shading the grid to show 43/100. So you're going to go ahead and do the first 3 problems on page 114 and pause this video. Unpause when you have completed the first 3 problems so that way you can see if your answer is correct. All right, before you move on, make sure page 114 is done. We are going to check your answers. So if you're writing it in word form, they have 43/100 recall that we talked about yesterday, you can also write it as 0 and 43/100ths. So either one of those answers would be correct. Let's see. If you wrote it as 0 and 43/100ths, or if you just wrote it as 43/100ths. Of course, it's overlapping. Let's see, can I move it up? There we go. Then you're filling in the place chart. So we had 0 ones, we had 4 in our 10th spot, and we had a 3 in our 100th spot. We had nothing in our thousandths spot, so we are not filling in anything in our thousandths box. And that's why we call it 43/100ths, because it ends in our 100th spot. All right, the shading, what we are really focusing on today, we would have 4 columns shaded in, because each column represents a 10th, and we have 4 of those 10ths. So 4 columns shaded in, and then we would have 3 squares shaded in, because each square represents a 100th. So go ahead and check that your box is shaded. Notice how it's nice and shaded neatly. I do expect that we are in 5th grade and we can also shade within the lines. So please make sure that you are taking your time and shading neatly. We don't need to look at problems 4 and 6. We're going to come back to those. All right, so go ahead and close your math journal. Let's look at our thousandths grid, and we are going to practice shading with a thousandths grid, because the last grid was a 100ths grid. Now we are going to talk about a thousandths grid. A thousandths grid, it's kind of hard when we're looking at it to see, but we can tell that there is this black outline here. I'll do my best. I'm trying with a mouse. It's hard to keep it nice and even. But do we see how we have tenths here? We have 10 columns going down. You can kind of see that they're bold-faced. 9 and 10. But then we also have the little boxes here that are our 100ths, right? The little squares. So we have 100 of these little boxes. And then finally, these little tiny guys that we talked about yesterday that kind of look like fingernail slivers are our thousandths. So this is where it gets really difficult when you're shading in thousandths, that you got to make sure that you stay within those lines, right? Those guys, I just shaded in 2 of them. They're really tiny, but those are thousandths. So we are going to practice shading in on a thousandths grid. So go ahead and get your colors out and let's shade in on the thousandths grid. Our first number that we are going to shade in is this. Do we think we know how to say that? How would we say that? We could call it 0 and 285. What place value does it end in? Thousandths. Right. Or, why does it keep disappearing on me? Or I could also call it 285 thousandths. and leave the 0 off. So either one of those are acceptable names or equivalent names for this decimal number. Could I write that decimal number also as a fraction? We also did this yesterday. We could write it as 285. Bear with me, I know it's a little bit messy. Over 1,000. So today in your book is going to have what they call a name collection box on the side of where this grid is. And you are going to have to write at least 3 equivalent names for each fraction. We also talked about, or for each decimal, sorry, I'm so used to talking about fractions from Unit 3. We also talked about how we could add zeros to the end of a decimal number, and it actually doesn't change what we have, it just changes how we say it. So I could have 285,000, but if I add a 0 at the end of it, it's not gonna let me. Right over there. Let's try this again. If we add a 0 at the end of it, it is still the same number. So just like how we in fractions would say 1/2 is equivalent to 2/4 or 3/6 or 4/8, we could say 285 thousandths is also equivalent to this number here, which is called 2,850 10,000ths. So we could keep adding, if I could actually draw them, we could keep adding zeros forever, and that would also be an equivalent name. So look at all these names for this fraction here. We have 285 thousandths, which could also be wrote as 0 and 2,850 10,000ths. Could also be called 0 and 285 thousandths, or we could write it as a fraction with 285 thousandths. So those are just a few names. So go ahead and list those over on the side in the margin of your thousandth sheet so you can refer back to them when you are completing your math journal pages. All right, so here's where it gets a little bit messy. I'm gonna do my best with shading, but I want 3 different colors out because this is gonna be helpful, especially as moving forward to the next lesson. We're gonna use a color for our tenths, a color for our hundredths, and a color for our thousandths. So if we look at our tenths, how many tenths do we have here? Right, we have 2. So you are going to shade in 2 tenths. Remember, the tenths are our rods or our columns or our longs. They have a few different names. And again, like I said, you're going to do your best with shading. You will be a lot better with shading on paper than Miss Vegedelum is with shading on the computer. So you want to just shade in the lines, not go over the lines. 2 tenths. Oh my. Oh. I went over a little bit there, but that's okay. I'll use that one for my hundredths. So we have 2 columns fully shaded in. Now I'm going to pick your next color and I'm going to shade in my hundredths. So how many hundredths do I have shaded in? Well, I have 8 hundredths. So each little square here is a hundredth. So I need 8 of them. I know there are 10 in a column. So I'm just going to go down and say, as long as there are 2 not shaded, then that means I have 8. And this is also where I go back and recount to make sure that I shaded the right amount. So we have 800ths shaded in. So shade in 800ths. And then finally our last number, and I'm going to make it really thin because it's hard to shade. We're shading in our thousandths. So how many thousandths do we have here? We have 5 thousandths. So you're shading in 5 little tiny pieces here. So you're shading in half. Because there are 10 pieces in a square. You're shading in half of those. And this is where it gets a little tricky. Even if you're doing it with pencil, colored pencil, it gets a little bit tricky to make sure that you're shading it all in. So we shaded in 285 thousandths. So that means there are 285 of these little tiny pieces shaded in. Pretty easy? Let's try another one. Your next number is what? How would we say that? So let's think of how we could say that in word form. We could call it 0 and 67 thousandths, since it's ending in our thousandths. Since it's ending in our thousandths column. Let's shrink it so you can see it. But we could also call it just 67 thousandths instead of having the 0. So there are 2 names there. On your practice, you just need to have at least 3 names. But could I write it as a fraction? Would that be another way to write it? I would have 67 in my numerator and 1,000 in my denominator. I could also write it adding zeros onto the end of it. When we add zeros to the right of the decimal after everything is, chalking and writing at the same time, and it's not working here. At the end of the decimal, it is not going to change the amount we have. It's just going to change the way we say it. So I could add a 0 to the end once everything is done. So there's 67 thousandths, but now I could call it 670 10,000ths. We could keep going. You could add another one. 0, and I apologize, writing with a mouse is not as easy as it looks. But now let's add 2 zeros to the end. Again, that does not change the amount because I'm not shading any more in, right? It's still only 67 thousandths that's shaded in, but now I'm going to call it 0 and 67, or 6,700 hundred thousandths. So we're not gonna keep adding zeros. Those are all different names that we could put in our name collection box, so you may want to have those wrote down on your paper if you want to pause the video. And then while your video's paused, go ahead and shade in 67 thousandths. See if you can shade in 67 thousandths on this grid correctly. Then unpause your video and see if you have it correct. All right, let's see. Did you get it right? We have 600ths shaded in and 7,000ths. Notice we have no tenths, so there are no long columns shaded in. All right, let's move on to the next one. I would like you now to pause the video and see if you could come up with some names over in the margin of your paper. What are some other names for this decimal? And I'm not going to say it, because if I say it, that's pretty much giving you the word form. So go ahead and pause the video and see if you can come up with some other names for this decimal. You could write it in word form, you could write it as a fraction, you could add zeros to the end. Go ahead and pause the video and see how many names you can come up with. All right, how'd you do? I have 0 and 504 thousandths. 504 thousandths. I wrote it as a fraction, and then I just added 1 0 at the end, so this would be 5,040 10,000ths. There are other correct answers, but did you get some of them correct that I had up on the board? All right, so now we are going to see how you do with shading. Go ahead again and pause the video and shade your 504 thousandths in on the grid, and then unpause to see if you got it correct. All right, let's take a look. We have 5 tenths shaded in, so that's 5 columns that are shaded in. As you can see, I did my best to get out of the lines a little bit, but it's nice and shaded in, other than under this little button that won't disappear. And then I have 0 hundredths, so there are no squares that are perfectly shaded in, but I do have 4 thousandths. So here are 4 little pieces that are shaded in. Not bad. All right, let's try one more. Ooh, tricky this one. All right, so I would like you to pause the video and come up with a few names that you could call this decimal, some equivalent names in the margin of your paper. Let's see. All right, let's look at all the names that we came up with. I have 0 and 250 thousandths. That's exactly what we see up there. Or, since it's nothing in your ones, you could just say it's 250 thousandths. But just like we were before adding zeros at the end, what if there's a 0 at the end? Is it okay if we just get rid of that 0? Are we really getting rid of anything since there's nothing there? Yeah, we can get rid of that 0 since there's nothing after it. We can get rid of that 0. So now I could call it 0 and 25 hundredths, because now it looks like, when I get rid of that 0, just 25 hundredths. So then that opens up the door to being able to write it as 25 hundredths as a fraction. Or we can go back to the original number and write it as 250 thousandths. And there are a plethora of other names, but those are just the names that I came up with. How many names did you come up with? All right, pause the video one last time and go ahead and shade in 250 thousandths. And unpause when you are done to see if you got it right. All right, did you get it right? You have 2 tenths shaded in and 5 hundredths. No thousandths. No little guys, individually. So, what I would like you to finish now is page 114 in your math journal. It says, for problems 4 through 6, use words, fractions, equivalent decimals, or other representations to write at least 3 names for each decimal in the name collection box. So they're talking about this. Then shade your grid to show the decimal. So you are working on page 114 and 115. There are 3 for you to go ahead and complete. When you are done with those, you may move on to the practice pages 116 and 117. Please make sure you're taking your time and showing all your work and shading neatly. Thanks for watching the video, guys. I know it's not the ideal way to get the lesson in today, but we got a lesson in nonetheless. And what's awesome about doing it this way is you can go back and watch it if you are stuck on your home link. Have a good one.